Dear students, today we are going to discuss this one of the very significant writer in your poetry part 2, that is 4th semester, and I'm going to give you a very good insightful about this. So let's understand how this W.H. Auden and the ideology of modernist poetry started. In fact, this is actually modernist poetry, there are few poets which are there in your syllabus. So before we read that poetry, let us understand what is this concept of modernism and how these from the theoretical perspective you can see that. So Peter E. Fisher, we are studying W.H. Auden and the ideology of modernist poetry. The origin of modernist movement in British poetry are anything but political. They derive partly from French symbolism and, as transmitted specially by authors Symonds, the symbolist movement in literature 1899, partly from a reaction against the support as spontaneousness of the great Victorian and even Romantic poet, a reaction which included a revolution of the metaphysical poets, and partly from the introduction by Pound of Far Eastern poetical techniques. Imagism, the first pragmatic manifestation of the poetical modernism in Britain, reflect all these tendencies. So here you can find out what are the main aspects, and this poetical imagination, modernism, then imagism. You know how imagism, or you can imagine unlimited, is associated. So this is related to symbolic movement in literature 1899. Now, the origins of British modernism are literary rather than political. But this is not to say that the movement itself was apolitical. The more or less enthusiastic flirtatious of the three of its principal representative, Yeats, Pound and Eliot. So there are three principal representatives are there for the modernist poetry: Yeats, Pound and Eliot. And Yeats and Eliot are there in your syllabus, W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot. With the fascist and proto-fascist political suggests that their commitment to modernism was not purely aesthetic. T.S. Hume, who more than anything else come closest to being the philosopher of the modernist movement in Britain, was convinced that modernism was not simply a change in literary fashion. Though he died in 1917, his speculations outlined almost better than any other subsequent criticism the broad course of the modern British poetry in modern art and its philosophy. 1914, Hume distinguishes between two types of diametrically opposed are the geometrical and the vital. Modern art belong to exclusively to the former category. It is hard, spare, elitist, imagist, anti-rational, anti-democratic, anti-realistic, dehumanized. So, these are the categories which are being. So, modernist art belong to exclusive to the former category, that is hard, spare, elitist, imagist, anti-rational, anti-democratic, anti-realistic and dehumanized. These are the primary aspects related to modernist poetry. Now, do we find any other inclusion in that? It is ultimately symptomatic of the change in the perception of the life, socially and ethically, that goes far beyond the realm of pure aestheticism. The specific political implications of this change are clarified in Hume's 1915 introduction to the translation of Sorel's Reflection of Violence. Here Hume unhesitatingly proclaimed his allegiance to what he termed the classic pessimistic, and its opponents would have it the the reactionary ideology. This ideology is based on conviction that man is by nature bad or limited and can consequently only accomplish anything of value by discipline, ethic, heroic and political. In other words, it believes in original sin. Any recognition and regeneration of the society must take into account man's innately fallen state and must recognize that reaction is an inadequate vehicle of the political reform. Such reform can only be brought about and only be sustained by actions breaking an ethic which from the narrow nationalist standpoint is irrational, being not relative but absolute. This is not altogether new. One hears unmistakably the voices of niches becoming in the background. It's certainly unambiguous. Modernists per se, by the very form it takes and techniques it employs, by its extravagant reliance on the symbol, that preeminently non-rational mode of communication, embodied a political ideology. This is unambiguous, but it is also true. It is true not merely in case of evidently political poetry like parts of cantos, but true also all modernist poetry. It is true to say, for example, that in retrospect we are or should be able to construct Mussolini out of pounds in stations of the metro, Charles Muran out of Elites, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the General Duffy out of Yeats, the Second Coming, and it is even possible to extrapolate a specific politic doctrine from any or all of these points. The unambiguous answer to these questions, I must think, be no. There is no immediate connection between these, or for a matter, most of the poems of the Yeats, Eliot, Pound and specific political ideology, what we can discern in is, generally speaking, a definite dissatisfaction with egalitarian democracy, a harking back to more hectic and more aristocratic past, an intense dislike for society without art culture or with debased art and culture, and abomination of the bourgeois monastery ethic and vague sense that sometimes must and will happen to change all this, though not necessarily sometime for better. Does all this constitute an ideology? If it does, then only because ideology is defined so loosely as to encompass virtually and any of the conservative views on life, human nature, cultural and values. And ideology may be based on such views and sentiments, and indeed Hume is certainly right in implying that all ideologies ultimately are based on such fundamentals. But the ideology itself is something different. It's pragmatic, specific and above all explicit in West and opposite for what modernist poetry essentially is. Hume is, I think, right only in a very limited sense. Modernist poetry is symbolist. Hume's used the word imagist, but in the event, images and symbols have usually turned out to be same, and modernist poetry is therefore irrational. So you know how the Hume using the word imagist, and can we correlate this imagist with the modernist poetry? And usually the rationalism is questioning spirit. These are all associated with modernist poetry. It is a hard poetry in both sense of word, and therefore attractive to only a very small audience, hence elitism. Rationality combined with elitism may in general way be equated with the politically reactionary ideology like fascism, for example, but only for the example. The moment one attempts to derive from form and method of the modernist poetry anything more, its specific political ideology is one is bound to fail. If modernist poets then at times possess and express specific political ideology, they do not because they are modernist poets, but because they are 20th century intellectual concerned with the social and economic and political turmoil on their times. Eliot Eliot in After Strange Gods in notes towards definition of culture and numerous occasional pieces in a criteria comes close to outline a program of political recognition. The same is true for Yeats's speech better and like vision on the boiler. Pound endorsement of the social credit theories and later of Italian fascism is notorious. But the important point to make here is that the political program only very rarely appear in recognizable form in their poems, and the exception of the Pound never in the major poems. Still, it might be possible to argue slightly revising and extending Hume's analysis, and although the bulk of the British modernist poet specifically ideological content insofar as it does not simply in rare instances that an ideology is always ringing. This is in fact roughly the position of the number of critics who have noted and attempted to account for the apparent predilection of the great modernist poets and that matter of modernist writer in general or fascist or proto-fascist ideology. 1943, writing about Yeats, George Orwell observed that you and large the best writers of the time have been reactionary tendencies, and decades later a lion-trilling remark in the liberal imagination or the utter differences of the so-called monumental figure of our time. Towards liberal democracy, Proust, Joyce, Lawrence, Eliot, Yeats, Mann, in his creative work, Kafka, Reich, Guide, all have their own love of justice and good life. But in not one of them does it take the form of love for their ideas and emotions which liberal democracy as known by our educated class has declared respectable, so that we can say that no connection exists between our liberally educated class, the best of the literary mind of our mind, and this is to say that there is no connection between the political ideas of our educated class and deep places of imagination. John Harrison is even more explicit. It is strange and disturbing phenomena, he writes in The Reactionaries, 1967. Five of the greatest figures of this century, Yeats, Lewis, Pound, Eliot, and Lawrence, were attracted by Italian and German fascism before the Second World War. In Pound's case, during and after the war, why it is that great creative artists can totally reject a liberally democratic humanitarian society and prefer a cruel authoritarian bellicose society. I mean, this is a very significant point which need to be read it again. So that's how Yeats, Lewis, Pound, Elias, and Lawrence. And the question is why it is that great creative artists can totally reject a liberally democratic humanitarian society and prefer a cruel authoritarian society. Hume appears to be right then in suggesting a connection between modernist poets and reactionaries ideologies, though not, and this is an important qualification, necessarily between modernist poets and such ideologies. It is indeed the absence of any major modernist poem and obvious right-wing ideology embark, again exception of Cantos, that has permitted a minority view to arise which maintain that there is no substantial or inevitable connection between literary modernism and right-wing ideology. Trilling, however, seem to suggest that modernism is anti-democratic for both the right and the wrong. Renato Poggioli, The Theory of the Avant-Garde, 1968, presents us with the scenario in which modernist aesthetic is immediately bound up with left-wing politics and language of the silence. George Steiner categorically assert that fascism has inspired no great work, with the possible exception of the motherland it has drawn into orbit. No writer of the first rank. Ezra Pound was no fascist. He used the occasion and trapping of the fascism in squeaky economic. Communism, on the contrary, has been central force in much of the finest modernist literature, and personal encounter with the communism has marked the consciousness and cheer of the many of the major writers of the age. Steiner's contention complicated the issues, but only I think because the terminology he uses is so very different from Hume's. That Ezra Pound was no fascist. Of course, true if one defines a fascist as someone who is a member of fascist political party, which is what I take Steiner's metaphor of being in fascist orbit to mean. Using such criteria, the only British fascist writer of the consequence is Henry Williamson. But then one might apply a same test to left-wing writers and note that Bertolt Brecht, for example, never joined the Communist Party. The moment one applies the term fascist more broadly, as I think one must do, it includes such writers we have demonstrated strong sympathetic for fascist or proto-fascist politics. We are immediately confronted with the figures of the Yeats, Eliot, Pound once again. Moreover, if we confine our examination to modernist British literature, it is difficult to find significant writers whose personal encounter with communism or even militant socialism made a positive impression on their work. Shaw, of course, springs to mind and does well, but both of these are highly ambiguous cases who could not just as easily be cited as exemplifying the opposite tendency. Indeed, T.S. Eliot in 1929 named Shaw and Wells as two major British writers who were moving towards fascism. So this is a significant quote, and it gives somewhere insight ideological belief system of these two writers. What is that? T.S. Eliot in 1929 named Shaw and Wells as the two of the major British writers who were moving towards fascism. Orwell, another such ambiguous case, and maverick socialist whose sympathies are on the one hand and anarchist left and on the other with the anti-intellectual Tory right. As late 1940, Orwell publicly expresses inability to feel any dislike for Hitler, while at the same time owing his willingness to assassinate him if given the opportunity. Moreover, neither Shaw nor Wells nor Orwell can be fairly described as modernist writers. They are modern writers in the sense that they wrote in the 20th century, but they do not belong to the modernist movement. So there are two distinctions we now understand. One is modern writers and modernist writers. Okay, so modern writers means those who are writing during the time period, and modernist writers means those who are associated with the modernist movement. And what are the criteria or what are the basic characteristics of the modernist movement, that also we need to understand. So this paragraph is very significant. Please revisit it, read it again, and write in your answer. The only writer in Britain during the first of this century, the usual time frame of modernism, whose conscience was powerfully marked by the encounter, personal and otherwise, with communism, and who were at the same time more or less modernist writers, were the members of the so-called Auden group. Of these, only Cicely Day Lewis and Stephen Spender actually joined the Communist Party. Spender's membership lasted for all of a day. What is more important is that neither Spender nor Day Lewis ranked as a major literary figure. In this respect, by Christopher Isherwood, and Auden himself qualify, and Isherwood rarely commits himself ideologically except when writing in collaborations with Auden. Auden then is unique. He is only major British poet modernist, usually identified with a left-wing ideology, such as his crucial test for the validity of the Humean theory of the reactionary literary modernism. For this example, he seems to confine that it was possible to write modernist poetry not only of the reactionary or political indifferent tendency, but modernist poetry expression or least simply or implying a left-wing ideology. If this is true, then it must follow a Hume is wrong. It is certainly true that Auden during the early 30s was strongly sympathetic to communist ideology, probably that of the beginning of this sympathy 1931, then when the Labour government collapsed and national coalition was established to deal with the increasingly severe economic crisis. In any case, the prolific and devour, Auden himself cites 1931 as the year initiated a new phase of political interest for young British writers, including presumably Auden as well. By 1934, Auden's identification with the left-wing politics was so close that and so well known that Edgar Foxall could praise him in an essay entitled "The Politics of W. H. Auden" as being, apart from the fewer regular communist chief protagonists of Marxist, Auden continued to be more or less engaged politically. 1939. Even if we take into account that Foxall is very likely exaggerating here, he is unquestionably right in pointing to Auden as a propagandist of left-wing ideology, right, and that if his claim based solely on an extreme limited number of poems and plays from this period, on the play The Dance of Death 1933, The Dog Beneath the Skin 1935, and the handful of poems which a communist to others, I Have Handsome Profile and Spain, are the most explicitly political. Some of Auden's less overtly political poems from the period, however, contains elements that run radically counter to Auden's self-avowed Marxist ideology. His most ambiguous modernist poise, The Orator, especially suggested that at its early stage, at last, Auden's communism was specifically like other people's fascism. Indeed, when Stephen Spender reviewed the work, he confessed to being unable to decide whether it was intended to convert his readers to communism or fascism, a view with Auden was later to agree himself. Moreover, Spender was eventually to argue that Auden had never really been committed to left-wing politics and all but merely used such politics as a means of strictly political ends. Towards Mendelssohn makes much the same argument in greater detail in his recent study of early Auden. So that if Spender and Mendelssohn are right, it would mean all the more gist of the Hume's reactionary mill. Be this it may, a communist or others, dating from August 1932, is unmistakably and unabashedly pro-Marxist. It opens with address to the comrade and then proceeds to a rousing condemnation of the bourgeoisie, but about whom it expresses the hope that fever should. Dragged on, this ran into an injunction to the modern and modernist poet to be mindful of his comrade, to stop being otherward that he is. Unhappy poet, you who only real emotion is feeling lonely when suns are setting, who fled in horror from all these to island in your private seas where Thoughts like castaways find ease into endless petition. You need us more than you suppose, and you could help us if you choose. In any case, we are not proud of being poor in that of which you claim a store. Return, be tender, rare we are more than you could face. This is powerful stuff. It may even be political stuff, but whatever it is, not modernist poetry. It is too obvious, too easy, too lacking the density and symbolic indirection that characterize poetic modernism. And significantly, it is not even purely Marxist and appear from intensely a Christian final stanza on the poem stanza which evokes love outside our own election, and election implying here not political even but quite simply divine grace. In the end of the comrade also cease even to be Marxist proletarians and become Christian brothers, and modernist poets in join not to practice social realism but of kind Christian charity that tend to be rather than revolutionary. So there is one point we are able to draw here, and what is that? What is the characteristics of the modernist poetry? So what is the symbolism, indirection? That is the characteristics of the modernist poetry. This point is significant, and you just need to remember, like if we are talking about modernist poetry, then symbolism and indirection, that things are not being told directly, but it is indirectly in a suggestive manner. When Auden included the poem in his book Look Stranger, he dropped the original title change comrade of the opening line of the brothers and omitted altogether the two stanza which I have just quoted. Along with four others, Auden's Marxism, it's clear that was in process of being dissolved into Christian fallow feeling, and modernist poet who was no longer to be charged with singing the ways of proletarian's bliss. The God place was beginning to look more and more like the city of the gods and less like Moscow. And all this was happening at the time when Auden was still supposedly one of the chief protagonists of Marxism. So Auden actually joined the party, and he is clearly a Marxist. So, and he's a member. So these are the distinctions we are able to understand here. That was a public view, but privately and being the scene, new different Auden was making himself increasingly fed. So for example, during Auden and Isherwood collaborations on what to become the essence of F6, the latter had kept a tight rein to Auden race characteristic, not suddenly flown down on their knees and break upon into the angelic song. When 1945 Auden shifted through all of his previously published work to put together his collaboration of poetry, he failed to incline a communist to others, and during this lifetime he allowed it to reprinted only once in Penguin Anthology of 30s verse. To the edition of this anthology, he wrote that he could only permit republication on condition that it made known that Auden now considered the poem together with several other poems for the same period to be trash, within which he was ashamed to have written. The poem only became readily available 45 years later when Edward Mendelssohn republished the English Auden. The next poem I have, Handsome Profile. So this is, this one poem we are talking about, and there he was very keen not to be published. So a communist to others, this is failed to include. This is a communist to others. Now the next poem we are going to discuss about, that is the next poem I have, Handsome Profile. Written in September 1932, is an attack on the middle class intellectual who cannot escape the general doom of his class no matter what he writes to do. It is no use us turning nasty, it is no use turning good. You are what you are and nothing you do. You will get you out of the wood, out of the world that has had its day. And like the communist to others, this is not a modernist poem, but a piece of propaganda in verse. In fact, Auden seems to have sensed very soon after composing, the poem never appeared in any of his collection. That leaves Spain, composed in April 1937. This is certainly the best known and probably the best English poem to have come out of the Spanish Civil War. It is curious mixture of extortion, reflection and dialogue. Without any formal division, it nevertheless falls into our 4 separate sections dealing respectively with the past and future and present again. All these sections fuse in the final stanza to take out of the eternity. The past is European history since the consolidation of the feudalism and triumph and the triumph of capitalism, including the Industrial Revolution and the age of imperial expansion. It is a kind of summary of the Louis Mumford's techniques and civilization, but very dense and poetic, quite unlike spotted history of the commentary in the time of the war, which was written a little later. The future of utopia, that is potpourri of hobbies and such breeding terrories, a scientific research into the octave of radiation and something that would soon be known more ominously as atom bomb, a suburban bicycle ride, and a political activity such electing a party chairman and enthusiastic majority. The present, though implicit and even invoked throughout the poem, culminates into the anti-penultimate stanza, which Auden later omitted. The revision which suffered and struggle are emphasized, but also need to hurt and to kill, as well as compensation of the shared idea and sense of mutual love and respect. As Spain's, unlike the two earlier, Auden poem is not merely a piece of propaganda, though it obviously contains propagandist elements, most notably in portrayal of the future with the cozy division of the communist camaraderie, but even present is romanticized. We are told of marvelous metamorphosis in which moments of tendencies can blossom into ambulance and sandbags. Hours of friendship flow into, of all things, a people's army. Even so, tone of the poem is relatively muted. There are no ratings here against enemies, for the matter that even any mention of the specific enemies, no smug self-satisfaction seemed despise system. That technique is one of the selected significance, not necessarily dramatic detail, but the party member and flat ephemeral pamphlet, and a kind of which its confusion, that ideology and class conflict, even civil war, can be dull, make a sense the existence of the real voices in the poem and not merely a voice of the party. There is also vaguely symbolic strategy in the poem, never entirely consistent but effective nevertheless, the identifying Spain with the life of force or even a moment at the death force, something which give the poem a psychological dimension absent from the Auden's and other explicitly political poem. So the search for the meaning by the poet scientist and the poor fuse into the vast metaphysical prayer to cosmic life force. Did you not found once the city-state of Sponge, raise the vast military empire of the shark, and the tiger established Robin Pluck Canton, intervene, descends as a dove or a furious papa or mild engineer, but descends. The life force which replies is a voice from within and a voice of the individual conscience, not of the class or history. It's a weak and ambiguous voice. What your proposal to build the just city, I will agree, or it is suicide past in the romantic that, very well, I accept. I am your choice, your decision, I am the Spain. Part of the weakness, the ultimate strength of this voice drink, I think, for the non-materialist, not even non-material substance of its messages. It is voice that oddly poetic, strangely Christ-like Auden, who mounted on donkey, tried to make his way of Valencia front of the winter. There is no idealization in this poem of the motives of those who joined the International Brigade. They include the idealist but also fatalist and romantic self-glorified. Nor is there at this point at least an easy schematization which permits us to conceive of the life and history in simple Marxist terms. The life force is emphatically not a category in which orthodox Marxists think. This is poem Samuel hints in the written elude pristine capture. The ambiguities motive become even more apparent of the stanza subsequently omitted by the Auden, in which occur the transformation of the ordinary life into military action. When Auden is returning to here, is a much earlier and more complex conception of political action and arises not simply out of external socio-economic consideration but also out of internal psychological state conception of which underlies. For example, the whole of that remark, strange book, The Orator, as well as Auden's later The Essence of F6. Even when Auden is ideologically orthodox, position of the language can lean him astray. For example, the famous infamous passages concerning the deliberate increase of the chance of the death, the conscious acceptance of the guilt in necessary murder. Overall, Orwell was to ensure this passage for having been written by the kind of Boy Scout of the left who had never seen anyone actually being murdered. Orwell, on the other hand, just because from Spain himself, where he had people being murdered and not just being killed, though thought knew therefore real murder like Stalin and Hitler, would never use such language, preferring instead of euphemism like liquidation. Orwell is stricturing true, and they have served his credit. Spain and Auden is political during 30 generally, but the way they beside the point. For although Spain, Stalin and Hitler are deservedly incarnation of the evil in our time, it is nonetheless probably true to stay and to like Auden never actually saw anything being murdered, despite indirectly responsible for the murder of the millions. The real point here, I think, does not concern the bloody hands, but the poetry. Neither Stalin nor Hitler was poet, and they were politicians who had Orwell himself demonstrated in another form much anthologized essay. Use words to make their ultimate meaning rather than reveal it. So here I end, because the same discussion about the poem is going on, and we have to end the poem here. If I'm getting further little more time, I will come and read it again. So in this way we are able to understand what is this modern poetry is there. Thank you so much. Share the channel.